This week's module is on gender. Gender is half of the material from Chapter 10, and then I'm also supplementing that with the gender socialization pages that we did not cover from Chapter 3, the chapter on socialization. There will be 5 Camtasia videos to cover this material, and they are not as long as the videos from the last chapter, the chapter on race and ethnicity. So we're going to start with this first presentation, which just kind of introduces some of the primary terminology, the distinction between the terms sex, gender, and sexual orientation, because sometimes students will use these terms interchangeably, and that's inaccurate. Then presentation 2 is going to focus more closely on gender socialization, and that's that material from chapter 3. Then presentations 4 and 5 are specifically talking about the material from chapter 10 that deals with gender stratification. So the third presentation looks at stratification based on gender in higher education as well as the labor force. And for presentation number 4 is looking at stratification in politics, and then also just in terms of violence. And then finally, the 5th presentation looks at the role of feminism and what the future may hold in regards to gender differentiation and gender stratification. So beginning with, for this first presentation, just a kind of introduction of some of the terms. So I like this graphic of the man and kind of indicating that sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender roles are all kind of distinct terms. We're obviously going to be spending a lot of time in this chapter, in this module, kind of discussing the distinction between gender and sex. But I did want to lightly touch on sexual orientation, which is who you are attracted to, because sometimes people will talk about gender expression, right, to the extent to which someone is masculine or feminine, and they'll link it to their sexual orientation, right? Like, I can tell that that person is gay, or yes, she has a short haircut, so she must be a lesbian, right? And I want to discourage you from engaging in this type of behavior. As much as we might feel like that we can see sexual orientation, that's not necessarily the case, and that what we are seeing is gender expression. And although there might be some very strong stereotypes related to feminine or masculine behavior in regards to how people might identify in terms of their sexual orientation, this is not a perfect correlate, and you don't want to treat these terms like synonyms. And if you see here on this, the genderbread person, really, you don't want to treat any of these terms like they are necessarily synonyms or that they always go hand in hand in the sense, because you know someone's identity, you know what their gender expression is going to be, or, because you know their biological sex or the sex assigned to them at birth, that you know how they might identify in terms of gender. So a big part of this particular presentation is kind of breaking down how all of these concepts are discussed separately, how they have their own operational definition, so that you can recognize them when you see them. And hopefully, if you are in the habit of talking about these terms interchangeably, breaking you of that habit. I really like the Genderbread Person V3.3. I think it reminds people to think about these terms as distinct concepts and discuss them using the correct terminology. So if you find that it is helpful, maybe just print this out just for to help you as you are going to be completing your assignments related to this chapter. So let's begin by talking about sex. So sex is, related to biologically, what you are, who you are. And oftentimes we think about this as being a binary, right? That a person is born male or that a person is born female. And there are kind of three primary sets of biological characteristics that we call upon to determine maleness and femaleness. One of which, of course, being chromosomes. Are you XX or XY? The other being, genitalia. So we have our sexual characteristics that are associated with males. You have penises and testes, and then we have our sexual characteristics that are associated with females, vaginas and uteruses and ovaries. And then we also have distinct kind of hormonal makeups where men have more testosterone, and women you have more estrogen and progesterone. And although both men and women have in much smaller amounts the hormones associated with the other sex as well. So we think about this binary in the sense of, if you are a female, it's because you are XX and you have this specific set of genitalia and you have this kind of specific kind of mix of hormones. But this is not this binary is not necessarily a perfect binary. We have become increasingly more aware that there are intersex individuals, and we don't necessarily have a perfect count of the number of people who are born intersex just because of the number of people who have births at home, or, the inaccuracies in doctors reporting them, or in some case, people who are intersex are not noticeably intersex until later in life when they go usually when they go through puberty, but sometimes as late as, when they are attempting to have children of their own. So there are roughly, this is the estimate is 1 out of 1,500 babies a year. And another way to think about that, or the more kind of a way that it's sometimes put, is that there are more intersex individuals than there are natural redheads. So if you know some natural redheads in your life, then whether you realize it or not, statistically speaking, you know people who are what we would consider to be intersex as well. And so, being intersex is just means that you have some type of variation from what is expected in the binary in terms of your genitalia or your chromosomes or your hormones. And so, an example of this in terms of hormones is the South African track athlete Caster Semenya, who has a condition called hyperandrogenism, meaning she has extremely high testosterone for a woman, much more so, than even normal women or women who don't have hyperandrogenism and have higher testosterone. Her amounts exceed even that, which has led to a lot of controversy in terms of her participation in past Olympic and track events. As far as you know, whether or not we allow people to declare children as intersex in birth, there are some countries who do. Colorado is actually was the first state to introduce explicitly intersex and not just a kind of vague, kind of like third alternative category. But Colorado actually has intersex as an option on its birth certificates, and that is very recent, as of 2019. So, for everyone that is one of those non-intersex individuals, one of those people that do consider themselves as just falling in that binary of being male or female. So the kind of next question to ask is, okay, well then outside of those kind of three categories of characteristics, chromosomes, hormones, and genitalia, how different are our bodies, generally speaking? So before we consider that in more detail, let me first say, when compared to other animals in the animal kingdom, animals like lions, elephant seals, peacocks, peahens, human beings have what we call a low level of sexual dimorphism, which means that the physical difference between the males and females is fairly low. And my apologies, I noticed that the photo of the lions is covering up the rest of the definition, but right, we have a low level of sexual dimorphism. When you think about lions with their manes, and elephant seals with their kind of protrusion on their snout, and their much larger size and their different skin, and of course, peahens, don't even look like peacocks. All those animals have a much higher level of sexual dimorphism. So, what about humans? How are we different? If you think about some differences, you might come up with, okay, musculature. Men are broader in the shoulders, and they have more developed pectoral muscles. Women have breast, as well as hips. Men have more body hair, and as well, and especially more facial hair. Men tend to be taller. Like, all of these things are true on average. But of course, you can think of a lot of variation around these kind of observations as well. Certainly, there are plenty of men that are slender, and in terms of musculature do not have very developed muscles. There are taller women and shorter men. There are women that have very little breast development, and there are men who actually develop breast. That's a physical condition. Similarly, all women, of course, have more body hair and facial hair than we maybe than what people may observe, because of the amount of time we spend plucking and naring and waxing it. But particularly, there are conditions that cause women to be able to develop, excessive hair, particularly facial hair. So there are women that have mustaches, and even some that have full beards. So, this point that our bodies are different, but a lot of these differences are very subtle, and have a high level of variation, is true. To the extent that our bodies look as different as they do, some of this has more to do with social practices. Women are smaller than men on average, but in terms of body size, but this might also have to do with the much greater social pressure there is on women to diet to be small, the amount of time that women spend doing cardio versus the amount of time that men spend lifting weights, and supplements, and doing things like drinking, creatine shakes, like that's targeted to men, because there is this societal kind of expectations that men's bodies are supposed to be bigger. So there's more pressure on men to develop a bigger body. I've already talked about, in terms of body hair, it's not that hair doesn't grow on most of women's bodies parts. It's just that we work very hard, a lot of us, to remove it, and men don't. And even something like height, right, which, can't be manipulated nearly as much, even that, just because of the genetic underpinnings of height, right, you inherit a lot of that is based on how tall or short your mother and father are. That means that there's a lot of cross-cultural variations. Men are usually taller than women in their own kind of country society, but that doesn't mean that they're taller across the board. So if you think about places like Iceland and Netherlands, where the average woman is 5'7", 5'6", meaning, obviously some women are much taller. If you were to compare that group of women with, for instance, the men in India and China, which are largely the average height is under 5'5", then that complicates that whole men are necessarily taller than women. And even within one given country, obviously there is overlap between shorter men and taller women. And to the extent that we don't really acknowledge this, or we don't really see this as significant, has a lot to do with kind of our societal understanding of height, right? The kind of subjective associations we make with height, especially in men, that we associate it with power and dominance and strength, so that being tall is seen as being manly in a way that being short isn't. So much so that, you have as an example here Princess Di and Prince Charles back when they were married and she was still alive. She was taller than him by an inch or so. However, when a stamp was put out to commemorate their marriage in 1981, you can see, like, if you were to estimate her height based on that stamp, you would expect that she was over half a foot shorter than her husband. And that's the type of thing that raises questions about, why do we have these assumptions around these physical characteristics? And that's a good place for us to move to the final concept of gender, because gender is just that. It is kind of the societal roles and definitions that we build around those sex categories. So if sex is biological, gender is sociological, is societal. And so therefore, gender is because it is sociological. It is socially constructed, similar to race, and therefore, as your book notes, it can be fluid. Those categories can vary across time and space, because it's based around society's definition of maleness and femaleness. And how we kind of define it, and how that definition can change. So there are kind of two components to gender. One is gender identity and one is gender expression. Before we get into gender identity and the kind of contemporary gender map, which is the word that your book uses, I just want to make one point. That the gender binary that we have maybe in the last 7 to 10 years, complicated with the acknowledgement of different identities and the introduction of different terms into the mainstream. For some people, this can seem like something that came out of nowhere, that reflects, a rise in plastic surgery and the internet and, newfangled notions of gender. And I always want to push back against these assumptions in students, because if you've ever taken an anthropological class, one thing that you should know is that other societies had broader, more varied gender maps, irregardless of their ability to, offer plastic surgery to make people look a certain way or to change people's genitalias. Because once again, it's related more to identity and expression, not necessarily to, actual physical characteristics. So this is just a list of other cultures that have had third, fourth, fifth gender options beyond, your basic binary of man and woman. And kind of the distinction between these countries and cultures and America and most of like Western nations is that countries that did not transition to the Judeo-Christian faith as early on in their culture's development, in their society's development, were more likely to have gender maps that went beyond the binary. If you were from a society or culture that adopted Christianity rather early on in your society's progression, you were much likely to live in a society where your gender map, your gender ideology was binary, and that largely reflects, of course, the messages from the Bible, that give a pretty clear binary at the outset of Genesis. But for all the countries, all the societies that did not adopt Christianity early, they have long had third, fourth, fifth gender options. And, I just point out some of them here, whether you're talking about the American Indians and their two-spirited categories. You have the Hira from the India, Bangladesh area. There are varied terms that come out of Polynesia, Mexico with the mooks or mooks, Brazil with the travestis, Dominican Republic and Guevedoches, Afghanistan and the Bashapash. You don't have to. I'm not going to hold you accountable for any of these terms, and this just gives you kind of some images to associate with some of those examples. I am providing you this information just to make it clear, although our expansion from the binary is fairly recent. That doesn't mean that other societies did not have more varied gender maps long before us. And so, what is our contemporary gender map? Well, um, recent acknowledgement, and by recent I mean, like I said, within the last decade, of transgender individuals in our population has kind of led to an adoption of like a four category map. Where we have cisgender men and women and transgender men and women. And that term cisgender and transgender, it relates back to the term we just discussed, which is sex. Because a cisgender man is a man whose gender identity of man aligns with the sex that he was assigned at birth, male. And a cisgender woman is a woman whose gender identity, woman, aligns with the sex she was assigned at birth, female. A transgender man is a man whose gender identity does not align with the sex he was defined at birth, which was female. And a transgender woman is a woman whose gender identity does not align with the sex she was assigned at birth, which was male. So that's kind of the four basic categories. But certainly there has been a proliferation of additional terms. And I just to kind of demonstrate that, I give you a screenshot from Facebook of all of the options that they have, the customized options that they have offered under gender. Words like androgynous, gender fluid, gender nonconforming, gender queer, agender, bigender, and some of these terms, like androgynous, relate a lot more to gender expression, because an androgynous person is someone that does not really express either strongly masculine or strongly feminine traits. Instead, they express themselves using a mix of feminine and masculine characteristics. Moderately feminine, moderately masculine characteristics, while someone who is gender nonconforming is someone that largely, rejects kind of traditional gender notions and definitions, while a person who's gender fluid, whether in terms of their identity or their expression, is kind of is identifying themselves as someone who is identifies as a man or a woman in various contexts, or presents themselves in more masculine or feminine ways in different contexts. So all of these kind of new terms reflect an expansion of our gender map, right? And the potential identities that someone can have in regards to their gender. Gender expression is how women or men are expected to act. And once again, just a reminder, going back to our genderbread individual, a person can strongly, solidly identify as being a cisgender man or a cisgender woman, and still, in fact, reject to act
what we would consider to be stereotypically masculine or stereotypically feminine. It doesn't mean that their identity as a man or a woman has changed. It just means how they express themselves might not align with society's definitions as to what it means to be masculine or what it means to be feminine. So let's consider those definitions. What is masculine? What is feminine? Because everything related to gender is a social construction. This does differ across cultures, and gender displays, which is how people express their gender, can vary dramatically culture to culture. But pretty much across all cultures, regardless of whatever the gender definition is, there usually is some pressure to uphold to some extent that definition. So in our own society, you might would like to consider, what would you consider to be masculine? Consider things related to appearance, consider things related to personality, consider things related to skills and talents and objects, right? All of those things can be gendered. So for masculinity, you might think of things like beards, in terms of or muscles. For personality, you might consider unemotional, strong, authoritative, a leader. For lights or talents, handiwork, cars, sports, athleticism, right? All of these are things that we kind of, in our society, have traditionally deemed to be masculine. For feminine, it's the same thing. Consider things related to appearance, personality, skills, talents, objects, and you might consider things like being pretty, being soft, being nurturing, being good at taking care of children, cooking, cleaning, makeup. All of those might be things that we think of as being stereotypically feminine. Now, in every society, there are multiple masculinities and femininities. So, what it means to be masculine in the Midwest might be different than in California, which might be different than it is in the South. And what it is to be feminine might be different for black women than it is for white women, than it is for Latinas. Or definitions of masculinity and femininity might change as you go from being a child to a teenager to an adult to a senior citizen. So there are multiple, kind of definitions of masculinity and femininity, but there is a dominant definition in society of masculinity and femininity as well. In our society, we say that the dominant masculine definition is something we call hegemonic masculinity, and the dominant definition for women, even though unlike hegemonic masculinity, there's been a lot of change and variation around the this definition in the last 3 to 4 decades. But nevertheless, it's a concept we call emphasized femininity. So we're going to start with hegemonic masculinity. I give you some good examples here that in some ways evidence hegemonic masculinity. Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, and I give you a link if you want to listen to that song. If you want to listen to that the song Gaston from Beauty and the Beast, they basically are just listing ways in which he is huge hegemonic masculinity personified. You have Tom Brady, that the athleticism, leadership of being a quarterback. You have Superman, saving the damsel in distress, being a hero. Marlboro Man, not so much that he's a cigarette smoker, but the idea of cowboys and, getting your hands dirty and being outside, ruggedness. Don Draper from Mad Men, that association with status and wealth and being a ladies' man. And then, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Terminator, the aggression and violence and toughness. All of this is hegemonic masculinity. And in sociology, we actually have a part of the discipline that studies masculinity. It's called sociology of masculinity. And those theorists have kind of come up with like 4 basic rules of manhood that in some ways still largely apply to men today, in the sense that not not that all men follow these rules, but that if you don't follow them, or if you break them often enough, there might be some form of negative social sanction. And certainly, if you do follow them in a lot of settings, you will receive positive sanctions. You will receive rewards for being the type of man that society says you should be. So these four basic rules of manhood. Number one rule: no sissy stuff. You avoid any hint of femininity. So if something is associated with being feminine, you largely don't do it. Whether that is crying or getting manicures or um, taking part in certain activities like, I don't know, dance, right? Whatever a society defines as being feminine, literally, since the first rule of masculinity is to avoid no sissy stuff, you basically avoid doing those things. The second one, be a big deal. There's still a strong association with men being providers, and so it is assumed that men should want to be a big deal, that and sometimes this is called being a big wheel. But largely it involves, you acquiring wealth and power and status. The third one is be a sturdy oak. It is that expectation that men shouldn't show emotions. Early childhood studies suggest that little boys cry at the same rate, if not more, than little girls up through the age 3. And then sometime between the ages of 3 to 6, they are socialized out of showing their emotions. They're told things like, suck it up, boys don't cry, be a man, be tough, so that by the time they are 6, and then certainly by the time they are 8, most young boys have learned to successfully repress their emotions, because that is the message that they've received from society. And the final one is give them hell, exude a sense of daring and aggression, is what that word should say there. And so, this explains why, of course, young men have a higher mortality rate between the ages of 16 to 25. They're more likely to meet their end via both violence as well as just dangerous accidents. And it does have to do with that association with masculinity, with kind of being a daredevil, or taking on unnecessary risk. And women don't receive that same message. And so this is why oftentimes this hegemonic masculinity, this kind of normative idea of male behavior, which emphasizes strength, domination, and aggression, why that term is oftentimes related with another term you maybe have heard in the media, which is toxic masculinity. And I'm gonna talk about this more in other presentations, but it's really this idea that by defining masculinity in this way, right? So not maleness, masculinity, which is fluid and which is socially constructed. So we could define it another way, but defining it in this way, where there's this focus on being aggressive, on being dominant, on being strong, on not having emotions, on taking risks, is harmful for both men and women. And that's kind of where that term toxic masculinity comes from. Now, unlike hegemonic masculinity, which still plays a fairly large role in how men even today are perceived, emphasized femininity really emphasizes it, or really relates to how women largely were perceived in decades past. And while some women still embrace this kind of ideal, it's worth noting that a lot of women post 1960s have moved further and further away from this, because an emphasized femininity, as you can see through these examples, cheerleaders, Victoria's Secret models, June Cleaver, Barbie, beauty pageant winners, Marilyn Monroe, the emphasis here is often on looks, being beautiful, being soft, being appealing to men, being supportive, being a caretaker, whether that's supportive in a cheerleading sense or supportive in a homemaker sense. It's this very old-fashioned, notion of femininity, and this is not necessarily how women are expected to behave today. There's certainly plenty of women that do still behave this way, and this might even exist in an ideal, as an ideal among certain men or in certain spaces. But it's worth noting that's why we don't call it hegemonic femininity the way we call it hegemonic masculinity. This is not even the the contemporary dominant way of being a woman in today's society, in the way that there is still a dominant way of being a man in today's society. And so that's it for this first presentation. The second presentation will pick up with a discussion of socialization, how we are socialized to accept our society's definitions of men and women and masculinity and femininity as being normal, and how that socialization also kind of primes us to make our own deal with the dominant definitions. And that is all.